What's going on, guys? This is VinylicPuma, back with another Borderlands 2 VR video, and today I figured we could talk about a few things I'd like to see get fixed, as well as some new features that I think, if added, would greatly improve the game. Now, before we start, I do want to say that I've enjoyed my time with Borderlands 2 VR so far, and I like this version of the game enough to where I hope Gearbox continues working on it after launch. So I figured I'd put together a list of a few things that I think, if fixed, changed, or added, would greatly improve the Borderlands 2 VR experience. Otherwise, and I guess without further ado, let's go ahead and start with the first thing I'd like to see get changed, and that involves the scoped displays on scoped weapons. While I must say that the current implementation with how scopes work in Borderlands 2 VR is good, as having the scoped view display on a 2D screen in front of you is a way better design than having to properly look down a particular weapon's scope in a VR game, it still suffers from a critical issue on PSVR in particular. To be fair, I suspect this is more of a hardware issue or limitation of the PSVR, but the actual scope display is very choppy, which makes using any scoped weapon way harder to use. While BAMF time can be used to mitigate the choppy scope display somewhat, it's an unfortunate situation as a whole, since aiming down sights makes most weapons far more accurate, and having to deal with the choppy visuals while scoped has made me avoid virtually every weapon that has a scope in favor of weapons with iron sights or just no sights at all. My thinking is, since Borderlands 2 VR already displays your aiming reticle on screen, a good fix for this until the PC version comes out might be to simply have a toggle in the options menu that allows you to enable or disable the scope displays on all weapons, making the aiming work essentially more like weapons with a conventional sight. This may present some issues for sniper rifles, but I think it would benefit almost every other weapon type that's available. Again, and to reiterate, the scope display is a good design and will likely run great on PC with the CPU that has a lot more headroom, but it would be nice to have a way to toggle the scope display off as an option. That way you can gain the better accuracy and recoil reduction that aiming down sights provides without having to deal with the current headaches from the choppy display on a PS4. Another issue I've found with Borderlands 2 VR involves gun/hand model placement. While the gun model placement is fine and much like it was in Legacy Borderlands 2, provided you're using a DualShock controller, provided you're using the Move controllers, you'll encounter this weird situation where your aiming is constantly thrown off depending on what weapon type you swap to. It sounds weird when I say or try to explain it, so I'll display some video footage of this so you can see what I'm talking about. But as you'll notice, as I swap from one weapon to the other with the Move controllers, it constantly throws off your aim despite remaining in place. My guess is this has something to do with the gun model and or in-game hand placement, as things seem to be improperly angled between various weapons where they really should be a lot more uniform. After all, and swapping to some DualShock controller gameplay for a moment, you can clearly see that the aiming reticles/crosshairs are a lot more consistent as I swap from one weapon to the next. So I would assume that what we're seeing here is unintentional. I think the reason this is important to fix is obvious, as your aim can be totally thrown off upon swapping weapons. So I do hope this is something that gets fixed at some point, since it would be a shame to be shooting a pistol, then have to swap to a shotgun, only to find out that your aim was totally thrown off due to the differences between gun models. Alright, so this next thing that I'd like to talk about involves movement. Now, in my opinion, Borderlands 2's VR movement implementation actually feels pretty good with the PlayStation moves, which definitely surprised me after my experiences with Doom VFR and, to a lesser extent, Skyrim VR last year. However, one of the things that's surprisingly missing in Borderlands 2 VR compared to the normal flat-screen versions of the game is the ability to run or sprint by pressing the controller's left stick. With that said, while it's true you can adjust the walk speed in the options menu, and you can also select a walk plus teleport function that sort of emulates and may even allow you to move faster than you could with traditional sprint, as far as I can tell, you can't actually run or sprint in this game like you can in the original version of Borderlands 2, provided you have the walk plus jump movement mode selected. I've actually been tearing my hair out over this section since I've been looking around online, and I have seen a couple of people say that there is a sprint toggle. which, if there is one, I sure as heck can't find it in this game. By all means, have a couple of laughs if there is one and I've just totally missed it, but as far as I can tell, the traditional sprint is gone along with its signature running animation. Now, I suspect the ability to run or sprint along with its animations were removed due to concerns about motion sickness, which is a shame since I think most people that are playing with the controller would eventually get used to the animations. Plus, in the case of using the moves, you could simply get rid of the camera movement that occurs while sprinting and just make the player slow down if they were to fire their weapons, much like you already do provided you're toggling aiming with the left move controller. Again, feel free to have a couple of laughs if I'm wrong on this one, but I don't think I am, and I'd like to see the Legacy Run/Sprint return with its animations in the VR version of Borderlands 2. Simply because I think it would make the game play and feel a lot more like the original. Speaking of the original, let's talk about driving. While I must say that I like the first-person implementation for vehicles, and I also like some of the changes to the controls, especially in the sense that vehicle turning is no longer locked to the camera like it is in the flat-screen version of Borderlands 2, I do wish we had a third-person perspective for Borderlands 2 VR while driving that was available as an option. Like I mentioned in the run or sprint section, I don't know if this was cut due to concerns surrounding motion sickness or something else, but I think having a toggle for third-person perspective while driving would be ideal. After all, Borderlands 2 was originally designed with that function in mind, and having the third-person perspective while driving would make it easier to deal with some of the bandit technicals during some of the story missions in the dust. I'm not sure how Gearbox would implement it, but third-person has worked well in other VR games. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice got a VR update that was supposedly pretty popular. And from my own experiences with games like Moz and Astrobot, though it is worth mentioning that those games were built from the ground up for VR, they do illustrate that third person can work pretty well. So I think if there are concerns about motion sickness, lack of immersion, or whatever, it may not actually be that much of a problem. But in the end, I'd just like to see Gearbox implement an optional third-person perspective while driving in Borderlands 2 VR, as I think it would make the game feel a lot more like the original. Another criticism and thing that I'd like to see get fixed in Borderlands 2 VR involves the game's UI. While Borderlands 2 VR's UI is largely copied and pasted from Borderlands 2, and to a certain extent it doesn't really cause very many problems, there are some situations where problems do arise. For example, if you open a menu and you're point blank or right in front of an in-game object, that particular in-game object can block the menus. Perhaps the best demonstration of this would be at one of the catcher rides, or if you're right up against a wall and you're accessing your inventory menus, or even provided you open your inventory menu while you're looking up an abandoned technical, as again, the game world assets can end up blocking your view of the menus, which is pretty frustrating. Now, I'm not entirely sure how you would go about fixing this, but if there is a way to fade out or make in-game elements or objects more transparent when you open any of the UI menus, that would be a definite improvement in my opinion. That way you can always clearly see the UI menus and navigate them more effectively. To be fair, I suppose this is a fairly small thing, and with practice it can be avoided by pausing or accessing the menus at the right times, but I do think if a small fix was made to make the menu UIs more prominent and in-game elements less prominent, it would be an improvement that makes the UI easier to use, and by extension, improves the user experience. Okay, so this next thing is fairly obvious, and I guess it's been talked about to death at this point, but Borderlands 2 VR would greatly benefit from having all of Borderlands 2's DLC. My only guess as to why it wasn't included initially is because there is some intention to maybe release it later when the PC version comes out. However, after reading a bunch of comments across the internet, as well as some of the reviews for the game, it's clear that this was a major point of contention for a lot of people. The fact that I don't have access to my interfacer, grog nozzle, magic missile, sandhawk, or any of the other hilariously broken and overpowered items from Borderlands 2's DLC is unfortunate. That, and it would be pretty fun to Gunzerk, Pyropete, and Ultimate Voltator mode with both weapons in my hands, as I'd have to imagine that being able to control the nuances of both weapons would actually be a ton of fun. Since this point has been beaten to death, I'll move on to the next thing on this list, but I really hope Gearbox does decide to add all of the DLC at some point in the future, as it would significantly increase playtime and make the game a better value. Plus, I'm sure someone out there really wants to go nuts with melee Krieg and teleporting. Now, this next thing isn't currently possible with Borderlands 2 VR, given that it doesn't support all of the DLC that the Handsome Collection does, but assuming the DLC eventually gets re-added to the game when the PC version comes out, I think it would be really awesome if Gearbox allowed for some kind of save import feature or compatibility, especially since Borderlands 2 VR as is a single-player game. Even if the PS4's implementation of this system was fairly similar to the system we saw in the Handsome Collection, it would still be a really great feature to have. After all, what wouldn't be more fun than taking the character you've potentially spent hundreds of hours on and finally be able to play with them in VR? At the very least, I highly suspect people are going to try to import their saves from the original Borderlands 2 once the PC version of this game comes out, provided we do end up getting all of the DLC. So you may not necessarily need some save import there, but if you did have it for the PlayStation version of the game, I think that would be pretty cool. Plus, since the save files are likely on the console's hard drive already, it seems like it would be a lot easier than using an internet service to transfer your old PS3 saves over. Ultimately, it's just an idea and would certainly be a pretty cool feature for those that already own the Handsome Collection. Now, this will be the final thing that I talk about, but sort of like I mentioned when I was talking about the DLC, there's no denying that Borderlands 2 VR would have greatly benefited from PSVR aim support. After all, Borderlands 2 is a shooter game, and the physical feeling of holding something that feels more like an actual rifle would be a lot more immersive. Plus, I think the implementation could work quite well given how Borderlands 2 VR animates parts of the player's forearm up to their hands. Simply attach those floating hands to the frame of the PSVR aim controller, and then adjust how certain weapons conform to that frame, and I think I could see it working out really well. Ultimately, it would be pretty cool to see PSVR aim support get implemented, and while I suspect it's probably not going to happen, I think it could greatly benefit the experience for PSVR users that own the peripheral. In fact, I'm kind of surprised that Sony didn't try to make aim support happen, since there are currently so few games that currently support it, and on top of that, there seem to be new PSVR aim-compatible games coming out all of the time, like Firewall Zero Hour and Evasion. Hopefully we'll see this come out at some point, but if not, it is what it is. Alright guys, I think that's going to wrap up this particular video. If you liked this video, feel free to leave a like, click the bell so you can be notified when I upload more videos, and as always, and again, thank you all so much for supporting this channel. Take care, and I'll see you all in the next one.